In a sterile laboratory somewhere in Germany, 1943, a young woman sits strapped to a medical table. Her name is Jadwiga, a Polish political prisoner. She watches in terror as a doctor approaches with a syringe filled with bacteria, wood splinters, and glass fragments. This isn't medical treatment. This is deliberate infection, designed to create wounds that mimic battlefield injuries. The doctor injects the toxic mixture directly into her leg, then steps back to observe. Over the following days, her leg swells grotesquely. Infection spreads like fire through her tissue. She screams for help, but the only response is meticulous note-taking. Her agony is data. Her suffering is science. This is just one story among thousands of medical experiments that transformed healing into horror, doctors into executioners, and human beings into laboratory specimens. Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazi regime conducted what they called medical research on thousands of prisoners across concentration camps throughout occupied Europe. But these weren't medical procedures designed to heal or cure. They were systematic torture disguised as science, designed to serve military objectives, test new treatments, and advance the twisted racial theories of the Third Reich. Over 7,000 prisoners became unwilling subjects in approximately 70 different experimental programs. 200 physicians directly participated in these atrocities, abandoning every principle of medical ethics to serve an ideology that viewed certain human beings as expendable test subjects. What makes these experiments particularly chilling isn't just their brutality, but their calculated scientific methodology. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully planned research projects, complete with hypotheses, controlled variables, and detailed documentation. The perpetrators believed they were advancing medical knowledge and serving their nation's military needs. They wrote papers, presented findings at conferences, and sought professional recognition for their work. In their minds, the screams of their victims were simply background noise to groundbreaking research. The origins of these medical atrocities trace back to the Nazi ideology of racial hygiene that took root in Germany long before the war began. Even before Hitler's rise to power in 1933, many German physicians and scientists had embraced theories of racial superiority and genetic purity. The Nazi regime simply provided these medical professionals with unprecedented opportunities and resources to pursue their research without ethical constraints. Suddenly, physicians who had taken oaths to do no harm found themselves with unlimited access to human subjects who could be experimented upon without consent, without anesthesia, and without regard for survival. The Nazi medical establishment created a perfect storm of conditions that enabled these atrocities. Academic institutions provided intellectual justification. Government funding removed financial barriers. Military necessity created urgent demand for results, and the dehumanization of prisoners eliminated moral constraints. Physicians enjoyed complete freedom to pursue any research they deemed valuable, knowing that their subjects had no rights, no advocates, and no hope of escape. The concentration camp system transformed human beings into laboratory animals, available for any procedure that might advance German military or racial goals. These experiments fell into 3 distinct categories, each serving different objectives of the Nazi war machine. The first category focused on military survival, designed to help German forces overcome the harsh realities of combat in extreme environments. The second category tested new drugs and treatments that could benefit German military personnel wounded in battle. The third category pursued the racial and ideological goals of the Nazi worldview, seeking to prove theories of genetic superiority and develop methods for controlling or eliminating populations deemed inferior. Understanding these experiments requires confronting an uncomfortable truth about human nature and scientific ethics. The physicians who conducted these procedures weren't monsters from another species. They were educated professionals, many with advanced degrees from prestigious universities. They had families, colleagues, and reputations to maintain. Yet, when given the opportunity to pursue research without ethical boundaries, they chose to inflict unimaginable suffering on defenseless human beings. Their transformation from healers to torturers reveals how quickly moral boundaries can collapse when ideology, opportunity, and authority combine. The first category of experiments focused on solving practical military problems through systematic torture. German military forces faced extreme conditions on multiple fronts, from the freezing temperatures of the Eastern Front to the high altitudes of aerial combat. Rather than developing equipment or tactics to address these challenges, Nazi physicians decided to use concentration camp prisoners to determine the limits of human survival under extreme conditions. These survival experiments were designed to answer questions that no ethical researcher would ever pursue. How long can a human being survive at high altitude without oxygen? What happens when the human body is exposed to freezing temperatures for extended periods? How much pain can a person endure before death provides relief? At Dachau concentration camp, physicians from the German Air Force collaborated with researchers from the German Experimental Institution for Aviation to conduct high-altitude experiments on prisoners. Their goal was determining the maximum altitude from which crews of damaged aircraft could parachute to safety. Approximately 200 prisoners were selected for these experiments, though selection meant nothing more than availability for torture. The researchers constructed a special low-pressure chamber that could simulate conditions at altitudes up to 68,000 feet. Prisoners were forced into this chamber without oxygen, then subjected to the crushing effects of extreme altitude while researchers monitored their vital signs and recorded their suffering. The high-altitude experiments revealed the methodical cruelty that characterized Nazi medical research. Prisoners were not simply exposed to extreme conditions and observed. They were subjected to carefully calibrated torture, designed to extract maximum data from their suffering. Researchers would gradually increase altitude, monitoring heart rate, breathing patterns, and consciousness levels as their subjects slowly suffocated. Some prisoners were kept conscious throughout the process, so researchers could observe their psychological responses to approaching death. Others were subjected to rapid decompression that simulated emergency situations aircraft crews might face in combat. At least 70 prisoners died during these experiments, though the exact number remains unknown because many subjects were killed immediately afterward to allow researchers to examine the pathological changes in their brains. The freezing experiments at Dachau represented perhaps the most systematic study of human suffering ever conducted under the guise of medical research. Beginning in August 1942, SS physician Sigmund Rascher began subjecting prisoners to extreme cold to develop treatments for hypothermia that might benefit German military personnel fighting in harsh winter conditions on the Eastern Front. The German army had been unprepared for the brutal Russian winter, and thousands of soldiers suffered frostbite, hypothermia, and death from exposure. Rather than improving equipment or tactics, Nazi leadership decided to use concentration camp prisoners to study the effects of extreme cold on the human body. Rascher's freezing experiments followed a methodical protocol that maximized both scientific data and human suffering. Prisoners were forced to sit in tanks of freezing water for up to 3 hours, while researchers monitored their core body temperature, heart rate, and level of consciousness. Some subjects were completely submerged underwater, while others were only immersed up to their necks. The water temperature was carefully controlled to ensure maximum suffering without immediate death, allowing researchers to study the progression of hypothermia in living subjects. Many prisoners died during these experiments, their bodies unable to withstand the extreme cold. Others survived the initial exposure only to face equally brutal rewarming procedures. The rewarming phase of Rascher's experiments revealed the sadistic creativity that characterized Nazi medical research. Researchers tested various methods of treating hypothermia, including immersion in boiling water, forced sexual contact with other prisoners, and placement between naked women. These procedures weren't designed to save lives, but to test which methods might most quickly return German soldiers to combat effectiveness. One assistant later testified that some victims were thrown into boiling water for rewarming, causing additional trauma and often death. The contrast between the careful scientific monitoring during the freezing phase and the brutal improvisation during rewarming demonstrated that these experiments prioritized data collection over human survival. Beyond the water immersion experiments, Rascher also subjected prisoners to outdoor exposure in the Polish winter. Naked prisoners were strapped to stretchers and left outside in temperatures as low as -6 degrees Celsius, while researchers monitored their vital signs and recorded their suffering. Some prisoners were forced to stand naked in the snow for hours, while guards documented their physical and psychological responses to extreme cold. The screaming and begging of these victims became part of the scientific record, with researchers noting how long subjects remained conscious and coherent before hypothermia affected their mental functioning. The documentation of these freezing experiments provides a chilling glimpse into the methodical nature of Nazi medical cruelty. Rascher meticulously recorded every detail of his subjects' suffering, noting that death typically occurred between 53 and 100 minutes after immersion. However, when Allied investigators later examined his laboratory notes, they discovered that Rascher had falsified his data to present more favorable results to his superiors. The actual time to death ranged from 80 minutes to 5 or 6 hours, meaning prisoners endured far longer periods of agony than officially reported. This falsification reveals not only the unreliability of Nazi medical research, but also the pressure these physicians felt to produce results that would please their superiors, even when those results were built on fabricated data extracted through torture. The seawater experiments at Dachau represented another attempt to solve military logistics through human experimentation. German military personnel stranded at sea faced the deadly problem of dehydration, as drinking seawater only accelerates the process of dying from thirst. Nazi physicians decided to test various methods of making seawater drinkable by forcing prisoners to consume different chemical treatments mixed with salt water. These experiments lasted for weeks, with subjects gradually dying from dehydration while researchers documented the progression of their physical deterioration. Prisoners begged for fresh water as their bodies began shutting down from salt poisoning, but researchers maintained strict protocols to ensure their data remained scientifically valid. The second major category of Nazi medical experiments focused on developing treatments for battlefield injuries and diseases that affected German military personnel. These experiments were presented as patriotic medical research designed to save German lives, but they required the systematic infection and torture of concentration camp prisoners to test new drugs and surgical procedures. At multiple camps including Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Natzweiler, Buchenwald, and Neuengamme, physicians deliberately infected healthy prisoners with diseases including malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, yellow fever, and infectious hepatitis to test the effectiveness of various treatments and immunizations. The sulfonamide experiments conducted at Ravensbrück concentration camp targeted primarily Polish women, political prisoners, and represented some of the most systematic medical torture of the war. Beginning in July 1942 and continuing through September 1943, SS physicians deliberately infected women with bacteria, inserted foreign objects like wood splinters and glass fragments into their wounds, and then tested various treatments while leaving control groups completely untreated. These experiments were designed to develop better treatments for infected war wounds that German soldiers were suffering on the battlefield, but they transformed healing into deliberate harm. The Polish women selected for these experiments were chosen not for any medical condition they possessed, but simply because they were available subjects whom the Nazi medical establishment considered expendable. The procedures followed a grotesque parody of legitimate medical research, with careful attention to creating controlled conditions and documenting results. Physicians would make incisions in the women's legs, deliberately contaminate the wounds with bacteria, dirt, and foreign objects, then monitor the progression of infection while testing different sulfonamide treatments. Some subjects received experimental drugs, others received established treatments, and still others were left completely untreated to serve as controls for comparison. The suffering endured by these women was documented not only in Nazi medical records, but also in their own testimony at post-war trials. WWII, one of the survivors, testified at the Nuremberg doctor's trial about the procedures inflicted upon her. She described the deliberate infection of her leg, the insertion of foreign objects into her wounds, and the weeks of agony that followed as infection spread through her tissue. Her scarred leg became physical evidence of Nazi medical crimes, displayed in court as prosecutors detailed the systematic nature of these experiments. 4 Polish women survivors traveled to Nuremberg to testify about their experiences, providing first-hand accounts that helped convict several Nazi physicians of war crimes. The gas gangrene experiments represented another category of infection research that pushed the boundaries of human suffering. Physicians deliberately infected prisoners with gas gangrene bacteria, a particularly virulent form of infection that causes rapid tissue death and excruciating pain. The infection produces toxins that destroy muscle tissue and can lead to death within hours if untreated. Nazi researchers were interested in developing treatments for this condition because German soldiers were suffering from gas gangrene infections in battlefield conditions. Rather than studying the disease in laboratory conditions or using animal models, they chose to deliberately infect human subjects and document their suffering as the infection consumed their bodies. At Natzweiler and Sachsenhausen concentration camps, prisoners were exposed to chemical weapons including phosgene and mustard gas to test possible antidotes and treatments. These experiments built upon Germany's extensive experience with chemical warfare from World War I, when poison gas had caused horrific casualties on both sides. Nazi researchers wanted to develop better protection and treatment methods for German forces, while also testing the effectiveness of chemical weapons against enemy populations. Prisoners were exposed to measured doses of these toxic chemicals, while researchers monitored their symptoms, photographed their injuries, and tested various potential treatments. The mustard gas experiments caused particularly severe suffering because this chemical weapon attacks multiple organ systems simultaneously. Exposure causes severe burns to the skin and eyes, damages the respiratory system, and can lead to blindness, lung damage, and death. Prisoners subjected to mustard gas exposure experienced immediate burning pain, followed by blistering of the skin and progressive damage to their lungs and other organs. Many died slowly over weeks as their bodies failed to recover from the chemical damage. Those who survived were left with permanent disabilities including blindness, lung damage, and severe scarring. The malaria experiments conducted at Dachau involved deliberately infecting over 1,000 prisoners with malaria parasites to test various treatment methods. Prisoners were infected either through mosquito bites or direct injection of malaria-infected blood, then subjected to different experimental treatments while researchers monitored the progression of the disease. Many subjects died from malaria complications, while others suffered permanent brain damage or other lasting effects from the infection and experimental treatments. The research was overseen by physicians who presented their findings at medical conferences, treating the suffering of their subjects as valuable scientific data. Throughout all these medical experiments, Nazi physicians maintained detailed records and documentation that reveals the systematic nature of their crimes. They photographed their subjects before, during, and after procedures. They recorded vital signs, symptoms, and responses to treatments with scientific precision. They wrote reports, presented findings at conferences, and sought publication in medical journals. This documentation served multiple purposes for the perpetrators. It provided evidence of their scientific productivity to superiors who controlled funding and career advancement. It created a veneer of legitimate research that helped them rationalize their actions. And it established precedents and methodology for future experiments. The psychological impact of these experiments extended far beyond their immediate physical effects. Prisoners lived in constant fear of selection for medical procedures, knowing that such selection usually meant torture and often death. The presence of medical personnel in concentration camps created a perverse inversion of the traditional doctor-patient relationship, where physicians became agents of harm rather than healing. Survivors reported that the betrayal of medical ethics was particularly traumatic because they had been conditioned throughout their lives to trust doctors and associate medical treatment with care and recovery. The medical experiments reached their most horrific expression in the pursuit of Nazi racial ideology, where physicians abandoned any pretense of healing to advance theories of genetic superiority and population control. These experiments represented the complete merger of pseudoscience with systematic cruelty, as doctors sought to prove their theories about racial hierarchy through procedures that had no legitimate medical purpose. Unlike the military survival experiments that at least claimed practical objectives, these racial experiments served only to validate the twisted worldview that justified genocide. The sterilization experiments conducted across multiple concentration camps represented a particularly sinister form of medical violence, because they targeted the fundamental human capacity for reproduction and family formation. Nazi physicians developed and tested methods of mass sterilization that could be applied to entire populations deemed racially inferior. The law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases, enacted in July 1933, had already led to the sterilization of over 200,000 Germans. But the war provided opportunities to perfect these techniques on a massive scale, using concentration camp prisoners as test subjects. Two primary methods of sterilization became the focus of extensive experimentation: radiation exposure and chemical injection. At Auschwitz and other camps, prisoners were subjected to high-dose X-ray radiation directed at their reproductive organs, while researchers monitored the effectiveness of different exposure levels and techniques. The radiation caused severe burns, internal damage, and often death, but Nazi physicians meticulously documented which dosages achieved sterilization without immediately killing their subjects. The goal was developing methods that could sterilize large numbers of people quickly and efficiently, making it possible to render entire populations unable to reproduce while keeping them alive for forced labor. The chemical sterilization experiments involved injecting various substances directly into the reproductive organs of both men and women. Physicians tested compounds including silver nitrate, formalin, and other caustic chemicals that would permanently damage reproductive capacity. These injections caused excruciating pain, severe infections, and often death from complications. But researchers continued refining their techniques to find the most effective methods. Women prisoners were subjected to particularly brutal procedures, including the injection of chemicals directly into their uterus and ovaries without any form of anesthesia. Many died from infections or internal bleeding, while survivors faced lifelong health complications and infertility. The man who became synonymous with Nazi medical experimentation was Josef Mengele, known throughout Auschwitz as the Angel of Death. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943 with impressive academic credentials, holding doctoral degrees in both anthropology and medicine from prestigious German universities. His background in genetics and anthropology made him particularly interested in using the concentration camp population to advance Nazi racial theories through human experimentation. Mengele saw Auschwitz not as a place of suffering and death, but as an unprecedented research opportunity where he could conduct studies impossible in any normal academic setting. What made Mengele particularly dangerous was his combination of scientific ambition with complete moral indifference to human suffering. Unlike some Nazi physicians who seemed conflicted about their role in medical atrocities, Mengele embraced his position with enthusiasm. He volunteered for selection duty at the railroad ramps, where arriving prisoners were sorted for immediate death or temporary survival. His presence at these selections wasn't required by his medical duties, but he attended regularly because it allowed him to identify subjects for his experiments. Survivors remember him as an elegantly dressed figure who would point left or right with his riding crop, sending thousands to immediate death while selecting others for his research programs. Mengele's obsession with twins stemmed from his belief that studying identical genetic pairs could unlock the secrets of heredity and racial characteristics. No researcher in history had ever had access to such a large population of twins for experimentation, and Mengele was determined to take full advantage of this opportunity. He established a special section of the camp for twin children, providing them with marginally better living conditions and protection from immediate death in exchange for their participation in his research. This protection was entirely conditional on their usefulness as experimental subjects, and Mengele made clear that any twin who became sick or uncooperative would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. The twin experiments conducted by Mengele revealed the systematic nature of Nazi medical research and the complete absence of ethical constraints. Mengele and his staff subjected twin children to exhaustive physical examinations that lasted for hours. Every aspect of their bodies was measured, photographed, and documented with scientific precision. Children were forced to remain naked for extended periods, while researchers recorded detailed anthropological data, including head circumference, limb length, eye color, hair texture, and dental impressions. Blood was drawn regularly, often in quantities that left the children weak and anemic. These examinations were conducted repeatedly over months, creating detailed records of each child's physical characteristics. Beyond the routine measurements and examinations, Mengele conducted more invasive procedures designed to test his theories about genetic differences between races. He injected dyes into children's eyes, attempting to change their color, causing severe pain and often permanent blindness. He performed surgical procedures without anesthesia to study internal organs and bone structure. Some twins were deliberately infected with diseases so Mengele could observe how identical genetic makeups responded to various pathogens. When one twin died from these procedures, Mengele would often kill the surviving twin immediately to perform comparative autopsies on both bodies. The psychological torture inflicted on Mengele's twin subjects was as systematic as the physical abuse. Children were forced to watch as their siblings underwent painful procedures, knowing they would face the same treatment. Mengele deliberately created psychological stress by separating twins and threatening to harm one if the other didn't cooperate with examinations. He used the children's natural concern for their siblings as leverage to ensure compliance with increasingly painful and invasive procedures. Survivors recall the terror of being called to Mengele's laboratory, never knowing whether they would return to their barracks or join the growing number of children who simply disappeared. The scope of Mengele's research extended far beyond twin studies to include anyone with unusual physical characteristics that might provide insights into genetic variation. He collected people with dwarfism, heterochromia, and physical abnormalities for detailed study and experimentation. A family of Roma performers with dwarfism became particular subjects of interest. with Mengele conducting extensive research on their genetic makeup and physical development. These subjects faced the same combination of detailed documentation and invasive procedures as the twins, with their unusual characteristics making them valuable research subjects until their usefulness ended in death. Mengele's collection of human specimens for research institutions revealed the broader academic network that supported Nazi medical crimes. He regularly shipped blood samples, tissue specimens, and other biological materials to researchers at Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and other prestigious German scientific institutions. These shipments were accompanied by detailed documentation of the procedures used to obtain the specimens and the characteristics of the subjects from whom they were taken. Academic researchers at major universities built their careers on studies based on materials obtained through torture and murder at Auschwitz, creating a web of complicity that extended far beyond the concentration camp walls. The pathology laboratory that Mengele established at Auschwitz represented the industrialization of medical murder, where human beings were systematically killed to provide research materials. The laboratory was built adjacent to Crematorium II, allowing for immediate processing of victims killed specifically for research purposes. Miklos Nisli, a prisoner physician forced to work in this laboratory, later testified about the systematic murder of subjects for autopsy and specimen collection. Children would be killed by lethal injection, their bodies immediately transferred to the laboratory for dissection and study. Organs, tissues, and skeletal remains were prepared and shipped to research institutions throughout Germany, where they became the basis for supposedly scientific publication on racial characteristics. The documentation of Mengele's experiments provides disturbing insights into how academic research can be corrupted when moral constraints are removed. His research followed many of the formal protocols of legitimate scientific investigation, with careful data collection, statistical analysis, and detailed documentation of procedures and results. However, this scientific methodology was applied to procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. The meticulous documentation that Mengele maintained served to legitimize his actions in his own mind and provided evidence of his productivity to superiors who controlled his career advancement. The broader network of physicians involved in concentration camp medical experiments reveals how institutional structures can enable systematic atrocities. These weren't rogue doctors acting independently, but part of a coordinated research program involving academic institutions, government agencies, and military organizations. Universities provided theoretical frameworks and career incentives. Government agencies provided funding and political support. Military organizations provided practical objectives and logistical support. This institutional backing allowed individual physicians to rationalize their participation as service to legitimate scientific and national goals. The post-war fate of Nazi medical criminals reveals troubling patterns in how societies confront systematic atrocities committed by professionals. While some physicians faced prosecution and punishment at Nuremberg and subsequent trials, many others escaped accountability entirely. Some fled to South America or other countries where they rebuilt their careers. Others remained in Germany, where they resumed medical practice or academic positions with minimal consequences for their wartime actions. The scientific community was slow to reject research based on concentration camp experiments, and some findings continued to be cited in medical literature for years after the war ended. The psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary physicians to become perpetrators of systematic torture illuminate broader questions about professional ethics and moral responsibility. These doctors weren't recruited from the criminal underworld, but from the mainstream medical establishment. They had taken Hippocratic oaths pledging to do no harm. They had been trained to heal and comfort patients. Yet, when institutional pressure, ideological conviction, and career opportunity combined with the removal of legal and ethical constraints, they chose to inflict unimaginable suffering on defenseless human beings. Their transformation reveals how quickly professional norms can collapse when broader social structures support or encourage moral transgression. The lasting impact of Nazi medical experiments extends far beyond their immediate victims to influence modern medical ethics, research protocols, and international law. The Nuremberg Code established fundamental principles for human experimentation that remain central to medical research today. The requirement for informed consent, the need to minimize risk, and the obligation to ensure that potential benefits outweigh potential harm all emerged from recognition of how medical research can become medical murder when ethical constraints are abandoned. Yet the persistence of unethical medical research in various forms around the world suggests that the lessons of Nazi medical crimes have not been fully internalized by the global medical community. The medical experiments at concentration camps created a systematic network of academic collaboration that extended far beyond the camp walls into Germany's most prestigious research institutions. Universities, government agencies, and private companies formed partnerships with concentration camp physicians to advance research objectives that would have been impossible under normal ethical constraints. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology provided funding and theoretical frameworks for racial research. The German Research Foundation supplied grants that built pathology laboratories adjacent to crematoriums. Military medical schools trained physicians who would later conduct survival experiments on prisoners. This institutional support created an environment where medical professionals could rationalize their participation as legitimate scientific work serving national interests. The documentation systems established for these experiments reveal the bureaucratic machinery that enabled systematic medical murder. Every procedure was recorded in triplicate, with copies sent to supervising physicians, academic institutions, and government agencies. Detailed photographs documented each stage of experimental procedures, creating visual records of human suffering that were filed alongside statistical data and research conclusions. Laboratory notebooks contained meticulous measurements of vital signs, as subjects died slowly from deliberately induced infections or exposure. These records weren't hidden or destroyed, but maintained as official documentation of scientific productivity that would support career advancement and institutional funding. Academic conferences became venues where concentration camp physicians presented their findings to colleagues who applauded their research methods and sought collaboration opportunities. The 1942 medical conference, titled Medical Problems Arising from Sea and Winter, featured presentations on freezing experiments conducted at Dachau, with detailed slides showing the progression of hypothermia in human subjects. Attending physicians asked technical questions about methodology and discussed potential applications for military medicine. The conference proceedings were published in medical journals, disseminating research based on systematic torture to the broader scientific community. These academic gatherings normalized medical atrocities by treating them as legitimate scientific contributions worthy of professional recognition. The selection process for experimental subjects followed calculated protocols designed to maximize research value while maintaining camp operations. Physicians maintained detailed records of prisoner health, age, and physical characteristics to identify optimal candidates for specific experiments. Children were preferred for growth studies and genetic research because their developing bodies provided data on biological processes. Adults in peak physical condition were selected for survival experiments because their baseline health allowed researchers to measure the effects of extreme conditions more precisely. Elderly or sick prisoners were often used for terminal experiments where survival wasn't expected, allowing researchers to study disease progression and death without concern for subject welfare. The psychological preparation of experimental subjects involved deliberate deception, designed to ensure cooperation while preventing resistance or escape attempts. Prisoners selected for medical procedures were often told they were being transferred to better conditions, or receiving medical treatment for existing health problems. Some were promised additional food rations or protection from other camp hardships in exchange for participation in research studies. This deception served multiple purposes for the perpetrators, reducing the likelihood of resistance while allowing them to maintain the fiction that subjects were willing participants rather than victims of systematic torture. The infrastructure built specifically for medical experiments transformed concentration camps into research facilities equipped with the most advanced scientific equipment available. Laboratories contained precision instruments for measuring physiological responses, photographic equipment for documenting procedures, and surgical facilities for invasive research. The pathology laboratory at Auschwitz rivaled those found at major universities, with equipment for tissue preparation, microscopic analysis, and specimen preservation. These facilities represented significant financial investments that demonstrated institutional commitment to expanding medical research beyond traditional ethical boundaries. The training programs for concentration camp medical personnel created a pipeline of physicians prepared to conduct experiments without ethical constraints. Medical schools incorporated racial theory into their curricula, teaching students that certain populations were biologically inferior and suitable for experimental use. Military medical training emphasized the importance of advancing German medical capabilities through any means necessary, including human experimentation. Young physicians arrived at concentration camps already convinced that their research served legitimate scientific and patriotic goals, requiring minimal additional indoctrination to begin participating in systematic torture. The reward systems established for productive medical researchers created powerful incentives for physicians to expand their experimental programs. Successful researchers received promotions, increased funding, and prestigious academic appointments that advanced their careers significantly. Published research based on concentration camp experiments enhanced professional reputations and opened doors to influential positions in medical institutions. These incentives attracted ambitious physicians who might otherwise have avoided involvement in obviously unethical research, demonstrating how institutional rewards can corrupt professional behavior even among highly educated individuals. The gradual escalation of experimental procedures reveals how institutional cultures can normalize increasingly extreme behavior over time. Physicians who initially conducted relatively minor procedures found themselves progressively involved in more invasive and harmful research as institutional expectations expanded. The boundary between acceptable and unacceptable behavior shifted constantly, with each new level of brutality becoming the baseline for further escalation. This gradual progression allowed physicians to adapt psychologically to increasingly horrific actions, without confronting the full scope of their transformation from healers to torturers. The international dimensions of Nazi medical research included collaboration with physicians and institutions in occupied territories, who contributed subjects and expertise to experimental programs. Medical schools in occupied countries provided additional researchers and facilities for expanding experimental operations. Local physicians in occupied territories identified suitable subjects among civilian populations and facilitated their transfer to concentration camps for research purposes. This international network created a continent-wide system for medical experimentation that extended Nazi medical crimes far beyond German borders. The cover-up operations implemented as Allied forces approached concentration camps demonstrate the perpetrators' awareness that their actions constituted serious crimes. Medical personnel systematically destroyed documentation, equipment, and evidence of their experimental programs. Subjects who might serve as witnesses were killed to prevent testimony about medical procedures they had endured. Research materials were evacuated to secure locations where they could be preserved for post-war use by surviving physicians. These cover-up efforts reveal that the perpetrators understood the criminal nature of their actions, despite their claims of scientific legitimacy. The immediate aftermath of medical experiments created ongoing trauma for survivors who faced years of physical and psychological consequences from procedures they had endured. Many survivors suffered permanent disabilities from surgical procedures conducted without proper medical care. Others experienced chronic health problems from infections, radiation exposure, or chemical treatments administered during experiments. The psychological impact included not only trauma from the procedures themselves, but also the profound betrayal of trust represented by physicians who had deliberately inflicted harm rather than providing healing. The documentation of survivor testimony provides crucial evidence about the human impact of medical experiments that statistics and scientific records cannot capture. Survivors described not only the physical pain they endured, but also the psychological terror of living under constant threat of selection for medical procedures. They recalled the betrayal they felt when physicians who should have provided comfort instead became agents of systematic torture. Their testimony reveals the broader impact of medical experiments on entire prisoner populations who lived in fear of medical personnel and lost faith in the fundamental human institutions of healing and care. The post-war careers of physicians involved in concentration camp experiments illustrate the inadequate response of medical institutions to systematic professional misconduct. Many physicians resumed normal medical practice with minimal investigation of their wartime activities. Some obtained positions at prestigious institutions where they continued research careers built on knowledge gained through human experimentation. Medical journals continued publishing research that cited concentration camp studies for years after the war ended. Professional medical organizations failed to implement adequate screening procedures to identify and exclude physicians who had participated in medical atrocities. The emergence of modern medical ethics as a discipline directly resulted from recognition that the medical profession had failed catastrophically to prevent systematic abuse of patients during the Nazi era. The principles established in the Nuremberg Code created international standards for human experimentation that emphasized voluntary consent, scientific validity, and protection of subject welfare. Medical schools began incorporating ethics training into their curricula to ensure future physicians understood their moral obligations to patients. Professional medical organizations established ethical review processes for research involving human subjects to prevent the repetition of concentration camp medical crimes. The ongoing relevance of Nazi medical experiments extends beyond historical memory to contemporary debates about medical research ethics and professional responsibility. Modern medical research continues to face ethical challenges involving informed consent, risk assessment, and protection of vulnerable populations. The legacy of concentration camp medical crimes serves as a constant reminder that medical professionals must maintain vigilance against institutional pressures that might compromise their ethical obligations to patients. The transformation of physicians from healers to perpetrators of systematic torture demonstrates that professional training and ethical codes provide insufficient protection against moral corruption when broader social structures support or encourage unethical behavior. The liberation of concentration camps by Allied forces exposed the full scope of Nazi medical crimes to a world unprepared for such systematic brutality. When Soviet, American, and British troops entered camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Ravensbrück, they discovered not only mass graves and emaciated survivors, but also detailed documentation of medical experiments that transformed their understanding of how far human cruelty could extend under the guise of scientific research. Military photographers documented rooms filled with preserved organs, laboratory equipment stained with blood, and filing cabinets containing meticulous records of procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics. The immediate challenge facing Allied investigators was comprehending how respected medical professionals had become architects of systematic torture. These weren't untrained sadists, but physicians with advanced degrees from prestigious universities who had maintained detailed scientific records of their crimes. Military officials struggled to understand how the healing profession had been perverted into an instrument of deliberate harm. The discovery of medical facilities equipped with the latest scientific instruments alongside torture chambers revealed a level of institutional support that extended far beyond individual moral failure. The testimonies of survivors provided crucial evidence about the human reality behind clinical documentation that reduced suffering to statistical data. Women like WWII, who had endured deliberate infection at Ravensbrück, traveled to international tribunals to display their scars and describe procedures that had transformed healing into systematic harm. Their courage in confronting their tormentors in courtrooms provided essential evidence for prosecuting medical war criminals, but also revealed the lasting trauma that extended far beyond physical injuries. The Nuremberg doctors' trial, conducted between December 1946 and August 1947, established legal precedents for holding medical professionals accountable for crimes committed under the cover of scientific research. 23 defendants faced charges including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in criminal organizations. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of systematic medical torture, including thousands of pages of documentation maintained by the perpetrators themselves. 16 defendants were found guilty, with 7 receiving death sentences and 9 receiving prison terms ranging from 10 years to life imprisonment. The trial proceedings revealed not only the scope of medical crimes, but also the psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary physicians to become perpetrators of systematic torture. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were following orders, serving legitimate military objectives, or advancing scientific knowledge under extraordinary wartime conditions. These arguments failed to convince the tribunal, which established that medical professionals have independent ethical obligations that cannot be superseded by political authority or institutional pressure. The Nuremberg Code, formulated in response to Nazi medical crimes, established 10 fundamental principles for ethical human experimentation that continue to guide medical research today. The Code's first principle requires voluntary consent of human subjects, explicitly rejecting the Nazi argument that prisoners or other vulnerable populations could be used for medical research without their informed agreement. Subsequent principles address the need for scientific validity, proportionate risk-benefit analysis, and protection of subject welfare throughout research procedures. However, the impact of the Nuremberg trials extended far beyond legal precedents to expose the inadequate response of medical institutions to systematic professional misconduct. Many physicians involved in concentration camp experiments were never prosecuted, either because they had fled to other countries or because evidence of their involvement was insufficient for criminal charges. Some resumed normal medical careers, obtaining positions at hospitals and universities where they continued practicing medicine as if their wartime activities had never occurred. The escape of Josef Mengele epitomizes the failure to achieve complete accountability for Nazi medical crimes. Despite being listed on war crimes registers, Mengele evaded capture and fled to South America, where he lived under various identities until his death in 1979. His escape was facilitated by networks that helped Nazi war criminals establish new lives in countries with limited extradition agreements. The failure to capture Mengele became a symbol of incomplete justice that haunted Holocaust survivors and their families for decades. The scientific community's response to research based on concentration camp experiments revealed troubling patterns of complicity that extended beyond the immediate perpetrators. Medical journals continued publishing studies that cited Nazi research for years after the war ended, treating data obtained through torture as legitimate scientific information. Universities maintained faculty members who had collaborated with concentration camp physicians, allowing them to continue research careers built on knowledge gained through systematic human rights violations. The psychological legacy of medical experiments affected not only direct survivors, but also their children and grandchildren who inherited trauma that shaped their relationships with medical institutions. Many Holocaust survivors developed lasting distrust of physicians and medical procedures, viewing any medical intervention as potentially threatening. This medical anxiety was often transmitted to subsequent generations, creating families where routine healthcare became associated with historical trauma rather than healing and protection. The documentation preserved from Nazi medical experiments serves as both historical evidence and moral instruction for contemporary medical professionals. Medical schools now use case studies from concentration camp experiments to teach students about the importance of ethical decision-making and professional responsibility. These historical examples demonstrate how quickly medical ethics can collapse when institutional pressures, ideological conviction, and career incentives combine to override moral constraints. The international medical community has established multiple layers of protection designed to prevent the repetition of systematic medical abuse. Institutional review boards evaluate all research involving human subjects to ensure ethical compliance. Professional medical organizations have developed detailed ethical codes that explicitly prohibit procedures that would harm patients or research subjects. International medical associations coordinate efforts to identify and exclude physicians who violate basic ethical principles from professional practice. Yet, troubling parallels between Nazi medical crimes and contemporary unethical research continue to emerge in various parts of the world. Vulnerable populations, including prisoners, psychiatric patients, and economically disadvantaged communities have been subjected to medical research without adequate consent or protection. These cases demonstrate that the institutional structures and psychological mechanisms that enabled Nazi medical crimes remain present in modern medical systems, requiring constant vigilance to prevent their activation. The emergence of bioethics as a distinct academic discipline directly resulted from recognition that medical training alone provides insufficient preparation for complex ethical decisions. Bioethicists work within medical institutions to identify potential conflicts between research objectives and patient welfare, ensuring that the pursuit of scientific knowledge never compromises fundamental human rights. Their presence represents institutional acknowledgement that medical professionals require external oversight to maintain ethical standards under competitive pressure for research advancement. The memory of Nazi medical experiments continues to influence contemporary debates about medical research priorities and resource allocation. Advocates for ethical medical research argue that the systematic torture conducted in concentration camps demonstrates the importance of ensuring that all medical research serves human welfare rather than institutional or political objectives. This perspective emphasizes the need for transparent oversight and public accountability in medical research funding and implementation. The stories of individual survivors provide the most powerful testimony about the human impact of medical experiments that statistics and academic analysis cannot capture. Their voices remind us that behind every clinical record was a human being who experienced terror, pain, and betrayal at the hands of physicians who had abandoned their most fundamental professional obligations. These personal testimonies serve as moral anchors that prevent the reduction of historical atrocity to abstract academic discussion. The courage demonstrated by survivors who testified about their experiences reveals the strength of human dignity, even under conditions designed to destroy it completely. Their willingness to relive traumatic memories in order to hold perpetrators accountable and educate future generations represents a form of moral heroism that transforms personal suffering into collective protection. Their testimony ensures that the voices of victims continue to speak across decades, warning against the institutional conditions that enable systematic professional misconduct. The responsibility for preserving the memory of Nazi medical experiments extends beyond Holocaust survivors to encompass all members of the medical profession and broader society. Each generation must actively choose to remember these crimes and maintain the institutional safeguards designed to prevent their repetition. This ongoing vigilance requires not only formal education about historical atrocities, but also sustained commitment to the ethical principles that distinguish healing from harm, research from exploitation, and professional service from institutional collaboration with systematic oppression. The medical experiments conducted in Nazi concentration camps represent more than historical curiosity or professional cautionary tale. They reveal fundamental questions about human nature, institutional responsibility, and moral choice that remain relevant to every society that values human dignity and professional ethics. The transformation of physicians from healers to perpetrators of systematic torture demonstrates that no profession, no matter how noble its stated purposes, provides automatic protection against moral corruption when broader social structures support or encourage unethical behavior. Today, as we face new challenges in medical research, genetic engineering, and biotechnology, the legacy of Nazi medical crimes serves as an essential reminder that scientific advancement must never come at the cost of human dignity. The voices of survivors continue to echo across time, reminding us that behind every medical decision stands a human being whose welfare must remain paramount. Their testimony ensures that the question posed by these historical atrocities remains forever relevant. What does it mean to heal? And how do we ensure that the power to heal never again becomes the power to harm?